I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. We're now on chapter 14, which is page 87. The bareness of Stamps was exactly what I wanted, without will or consciousness. After St. Louis, with its noise and activity, its trucks and buses, and loud family gatherings, I welcomed the obscure lanes and lonely bungalows set back deep in the dirt yards. The resignation of its inhabitants encouraged me to relax. They showed me a contentment based on the belief that nothing more was coming to them, although a great deal more was due. Their decision to be satisfied with life's inequities was a lesson for me. Entering Stamps, I had the feeling that I was stepping over the borderlines of the map and would fall, without fear, right off the end of the world. Nothing more could happen, for in Stamps, nothing happened. Into this cocoon I crept. For an indeterminate time, nothing was demanded of me or of Bailey. We were, after all, Mrs. Henderson's California grandchildren, and I had been away on a glamorous trip way up north to the fabulous St. Louis. Our father had come the year before, driving a big shiny automobile and speaking the King's English with a big city accent. So all we had to do was lie quiet for months and rake in the profits of our adventures. Farmers and maids, cooks and handymen, carpenters, and all the children in town made regular pilgrimages to the store just to see the travelers. They stood around like cut-out cardboard figures and asked, "Well, how is it up north? See any of them big buildings? Ever ride in one of them elevators? Was you scared? White folks any different like they say?" Bailey took it upon himself to answer every question, and from a corner of his lively imagination wove a tapestry of entertainment for them that I was sure was as foreign to him as it was to me. He, as usual, spoke precisely. They have it in the north, buildings so high that for months in the winter you can't see the top floors. Tell the truth. They've got watermelons twice the size of a cow's head and sweeter than syrup. I distinctly remember his intent face and the fascinated faces of his listeners. And if you can count the watermelon seeds before it's cut open, you can win $5 zillion and a new car. Mama, knowing Bailey, warned, "Now, Jew, be careful. You don't slip up on a not true." Nice people didn't say lie. Everybody wears new clothes and have inside toilets. If you fall down in one of them, you get flushed away into the Mississippi River. Some people have ice boxes, only the proper name is cold spot or Frigidaire. The snow is so deep you can get buried right outside your door, and people won't find you for a year. We made ice cream out of the snow. That was the only fact that I could have supported. During the winter, we had collected a bowl of snow and poured pet milk over it, and sprinkled it with sugar and called it ice cream. Mama beamed, and Uncle Willie was proud when Bailey regaled the customers with our exploits. We were drawing cards for the store, and objects of the town's adoration. Our journey to magical places alone was a spot of color on the town's drab canvas, and our return made us even more the most enviable of all people. High spots in Stamps were usually negative: droughts, floods, lynchings, and deaths. Bailey played on the country folks' need for diversion. Just after our return, he had taken to sarcasm, picked it up as one might pick up a stone and put it snuff-like under his lip. The double entendres, the two-pronged sentences, slid over his tongue to dart rapier-like into anything that happened to be in the way. Our customers, though, generally were so straight-thinking and speaking that they were never hurt by his attacks. They didn't comprehend them. Bailey Jr. sound just like Big Bailey, got a silver tongue just like his daddy's. I hear tell they don't pick cotton up there. How the people live then? Bailey said that the cotton up north was so tall, if ordinary people tried to pick it, they'd have to get up on a ladder. So the cotton farmers had their cotton picked by machines. For a while, I was the only recipient of Bailey's kindness. It was not that he pitied me, but that he felt we were in the same boat for different reasons, and that I could understand his frustration just as he could countenance my withdrawal. I never knew if Uncle Willie had been told about the incident in St. Louis, but sometimes I caught him watching me with a far-off look in his big eyes. Then he would quickly send me on some errand that would take me out of his presence. When that happened, I was both relieved and ashamed. I certainly didn't want a cripple's sympathy. That would have been a case of the blind leading the blind. Nor did I want Uncle Willie, whom I loved in my fashion, to think of me as being sinful and dirty. If he thought so, at least I didn't want to know it. Sounds came to me dully, as if people were speaking through their handkerchiefs, or with their hands over their mouths. Colors weren't true either, but rather a vague assortment of shaded pastels that indicated not so much color was faded familiarities. People's names escaped me, and I began to worry over my sanity. After all, we had been away less than a year, and customers whose accounts I had formerly remembered without consulting the ledger were now complete strangers. People except Mama and Uncle Willie accepted my unwillingness to talk as natural outgrowth of a reluctant return to the South, and an indication that I was pining for the high times we had had in the big city. Then, too, I was well known for being tender-hearted. Southern Negroes use that term to mean sensitive and tended to look upon a person with that affliction as being a little sick or in delicate health. So I was not so much forgiven as I was understood. Now we're on chapter 15. For nearly a year, I sopped around the house, the store, the school, and the church, like an old biscuit, dirty and inedible. Then I met, or rather got to know, the lady who threw me my first lifeline. Mrs. Bertha Flowers was the aristocrat of black stamps. She had the grace of control to appear warm in the coldest weather. And on the Arkansas summer days, it seemed she had a private breeze which swirled around, cooling her. She was thin without the taut look of wire people, and her printed vial dresses and flowered hats were as right for her as denim overalls for a farmer. She was our side's answer to the richest white woman in town. Her skin was a rich black that would have peeled like a plum if snagged. But then no one would have thought of getting close enough to Mrs. Flowers to ruffle her dress, let alone snag her skin. She didn't encourage familiarity. She wore gloves, too. I don't think I ever saw Mrs. Flowers laugh, but she smiled often, a slow widening of her thin black lips to show even small white teeth, then the slow, effortless closing. When she chose to smile on me, I always wanted to thank her. The action was so graceful and inclusively benign. She was one of the few gentlewomen I I have ever known, and has remained throughout my life the measure of what a human being can be. Mama had a strange relationship with her. Most often when she passed on the road in front of the store, she spoke to Mama in that soft yet caring voice. "Good day, Mrs. Henderson." Mama responded with, "How you, Sister Flowers?" Mrs. Flowers didn't belong to our church, nor was she Mama's familiar. Why on earth did she insist on calling her Sister Flowers? Shame made me want to hide my face. Mrs. Flowers deserved better than to be called sister. Then Mama left out the verb. Why not ask, "How are you, Mrs. Flowers?" With the unbalanced passion of the young, I hated her for showing her ignorance to Mrs. Flowers. It didn't occur to me for many years that they were as alike as sisters, separated only by formal education. Although I was upset, neither of the women was in the least shaken by what I thought an unceremonious greeting. Mrs. Flowers would continue her easy gait up the hill to her little bungalow, and Mama kept on shelling peas or doing whatever had brought her to the front porch. Occasionally, though, Mrs. Flowers would drift off the road and down to the store, and Mama would say to me, "Sister, you go on and play." As I left, I would hear the beginning of an intimate conversation, Mama persistently using the wrong verb or none at all. Brother and Sister Wilcox is surely the meanest. Is Mama is? Oh, please, not is Mama for two or more. But they talked, and from the side of the building where I waited for the ground to open up and swallow me, I heard the soft voice Mrs. Flowers and the textured voice of my grandmother merging and melting. They were interrupted from time to time by giggles that must have come from Mrs. Flowers. Mama never giggled in her life. Then she was gone. She appealed to me because she was like people I had never met personally, like women in English novels who walked the moors, whatever they were, with their loyal dogs racing at a respectful distance, like the women who sat in front of roaring fireplaces drinking tea incessantly from silver trays full of scones and crumpets. Women who walked over the heath and read Morocco-bound books and had two last names divided by a hyphen. It would be safe to say that she made me proud to be Negro, just by being herself. She acted just as refined as white folks in the movies and books, and she was more beautiful, or none of them could have come near that warm color without looking gray by comparison. It was fortunate that I never saw her in the company of po white folks, for since they tend to think of their whiteness as an evenizer, I am certain that I would have had to hear her spoken to commonly as Bertha, and my image of her would have been shattered, like the unmendable Humpty Dumpty. One summer afternoon, sweet milk fresh in my memory, she stopped in at the store to buy provisions. Another Negro woman of her health and age would have been expected to carry the paper sacks home in one hand, but Mama said, "Sister Flowers, I'll send Bailey up to your house with these things." She smiled that slow-dragging smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I'd prefer Marguerite, though." My name was beautiful when she said it. I've been meaning to talk to her anyway. They gave each other age group looks. Mama said, "Well, that's all right then. Sister, go and change your dress. You going to Sister Flowers." The shift robe was a maze. What on earth did one put on to go to Mrs. Flowers' house? I knew I shouldn't put on a Sunday dress. It might be sacrilegious. Certainly not a house dress, since I was already wearing a fresh one. I chose a school dress, naturally. It was formal without suggesting that going to Mrs. Flower's house was equivalent to attending church. I trusted myself back into the store. Now don't you look nice. I had chosen the right thing for once. Mrs. Henderson, you make most of the children's clothes, don't you? Yes, ma'am, sure do. Store-bought clothes ain't hardly worth the thread it take to stitch them. I'll say you do a lovely job, though. So neat. That dress looks professional. Mama was enjoying the seldom received compliments, since everyone we knew, except Mrs. Flowers, of course, could sew competently. Praise was rarely handed out for the commonly practiced craft. I try, with the help of the Lord, Sister Flowers, to finish the inside just like I does the outside. Come here, sister. I had buttoned up the collar and tied the belt, apron-like, in back. Mama told me to turn around. With one hand she pulled the strings, and the belt fell free on both sides of my waist. Then her large hands were on my neck, opening the button loops. I was terrified. What was happening? Take it off, sister. She had her hands on the hem of the dress. I don't need to see the inside, Mrs. Henderson. I can tell. But the dress was over my head and my arms were stuck in the sleeves. Mama said, that'll do. See here, Sister Flowers. French seams around the armholes. Through the cloth film. I saw the shadow approach. That makes it last longer. Children those days would bust out the sheet metal clothes. They so rough. That is very good job, Mrs. Henderson. You should be proud. You can put your dress back on, Marguerite. No, ma'am. Pride is a sin, and according to the good book, it goeth before a fall. That's right, so the Bible says. It's a good thing to keep in mind. I wouldn't look at either of them. Mama hadn't thought of taking off my dress in front of Mrs. Flowers would kill me stone dead. If I had refused, she would have thought I was trying to be womanish, and might have remembered St. Louis. Mrs. Flowers had known that I wouldn't be embarrassed, and that was even worse. I picked up the groceries that went out to wait in the hot sunshine. It would be fitting if I got a sunstroke and died before they came outside. Just dropped dead on the slanting porch. There was a little path beside the rocky road, and Mrs. Flowers walked in front, swinging her arms and picking her way over the stones. She said, without turning her head to me, I hear you're very good with schoolwork, Marguerite, but that's all written. But that it's all written. The teachers report that they have trouble getting you to talk in class. We passed a triangular farm on our left, and the path widened to allow us to walk together. I hung back in the separate, unasked and unanswerable questions. Come and walk along with me, Marguerite. I couldn't have refused even if I wanted to. She pronounced my name so nicely. Or more correctly, she spoke each word with such clarity that I was certain a foreigner who didn't understand English could have understood her. Now, no one is going to make you talk, possibly no one can, but bear in mind language is man's way of communicating with his fellow man, and it's a language alone which separates him from the lower animals. What was a totally new idea to me, and I would need time to think about it. Your grandmother says you read a lot, every chance you get. That's good, but not good enough. Words mean more than what is set down on paper. It takes the human voice to infuse them with the shades of deeper meaning. I memorized the part about the human voice infusing words. It seemed so valid and poetic. She said she was going to give me some books, that I not only must read them, I must read them aloud. She suggested that I try to make a sentence sound in as many different ways as possible. I'll accept no excuse from you. Return a book to me that has been badly handled. I'll accept no excuse if you return a book to me that has been badly handled. My imagination boggled at the punishment I would deserve if in fact I did abuse a book of Mrs. Flowers. Death would be too kind and brief. The odors in the house surprised me. Somehow I had never connected Mrs. Flowers with food or eating or any other common experience of common people. There must have been an outhouse, too, but my mind never recorded it. The sweet scent of vanilla had met us as she opened the door. I made tea cookies this morning. You see, I had planned to invite you for cookies and lemonade so we could have this little chat. The lemonade is in the icebox. It followed that Mrs. Flowers would have ice on an ordinary day, when most families in our town bought ice late on Saturdays only a few times during the summer to be used in the wooden ice cream freezers. She took the bags from me and disappeared through the kitchen door. I looked around the room that I had never in my wildest fantasies imagined I would see. Brown photographs leered or threatened from the walls, and the white, freshly done curtains pushed against themselves and against the wind. I wanted to gobble up the entire room and take it to Bailey, who would help me analyze and enjoy it. Have a seat, Marguerite, over there by the table. She carried a platter covered with a tea towel, although she warned that she hadn't tried her hand at baking sweets for some time. I was certain that, like everything else about her, the cookies would be perfect. They were flat round wafers, slightly browned on the edges and buttery yellow in the center. With the cold lemonade, they were sufficient for childhood's lifelong diet. Remembering my manners, I took nice little lady bites off the edges. She said she had made them especially for me, and that she had a few in the kitchen that I could take home to my brother. So I jammed one whole cake in my mouth, and the rough crumbs scratched the insides of my jaws. And if I hadn't had to swallow, it would have been a dream come true. As I ate, she began the first of what we later called my lessons in living. She said that I must always be intolerant of ignorance, but understanding of illiteracy. That some people, unable to go to school, were more educated, even more intelligent than college professors. She encouraged me to listen carefully to what country people called mother wit. That in those homely sayings was couched the collective wisdom of generations. When I finished the cookies, she brushed off the table and brought a thick, small book from the bookcase. I had read A Tale of Two Cities and found it up to my standard as a romantic novel. She opened the first page, and I heard poetry for the first time in my life. It was the best of time and the worst of times. Her voice slid in and curved down through and over the words. She was nearly singing. I wanted to look at the pages. Were they the same that I had read? Or were the notes music-lined on the pages as a hymn in a book? Her sounds began cascading gently. I knew from listening to 1,000 preachers that she was nearing the end of her reading, and I hadn't really heard to understand a single word. How do you like that? It occurred to me that she expected a response. The sweet vanilla flavor was still on my tongue, and her reading was a wonder in my ears. I had to speak. I said, "Yes, ma'am." It was the least I could do, but it was the most also. There's one more thing. Take this book of poems and memorize one for me. Next time you pay me a visit, I want you to recite. I have tried often to search behind the sophistication of years for the entertainment I so easily found in those gifts. The essence escapes, but its aura remains. to be allowed, no, invited into the private lives of strangers, and to share their joys and fears, was a chance so exciting the southern bitter wormwood, was a chance to exchange the southern bitter wormwood for a cup of mead with Beowulf, or a hot cup of tea and milk with Oliver Twist. When I said aloud, it is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done, tears of love filled my eyes at this selflessness. On that first day I ran down the hill and into the road. Few cars ever came along it, and had a good sense to stop running before I reached the store. I was liked, and what a difference that made. I was respected not as Mrs. Henderson's grandchild or Bailey's sister, but for just being Marguerite Johnson. Childhood logic never asks to be proved. All conclusions are absolute. I didn't question why Mrs. Flowers had singled me out for attention, nor did it occur to me that Mama might have asked her to give me a little talking to. All I cared about was that she had made tea cookies for me and read to me from her favorite book. It was enough to prove that she liked me. Mama and Bailey were waiting inside the store. He said, "My, what did she give you?" He had seen the books, but I had held the paper sack with his cookies in my arms, shielded by the poems. Mama said, "Sister, I know you acted like a little lady. That do my heart good to see settled people take to you all. I'm trying my best, the Lord knows, but these days," her voice trailed off. "Go on in and change your dress." In the bedroom, it was going to be a joy to see Bailey receive his cookies. I said, "By the way, Bailey, Mrs. Flowers sent you some tea cookies." Mama shouted, "What did you say, sister?" "You, sister, what did you say?" Hot anger was crackling in her voice. Bailey said, "She said Mrs. Flowers sent me some." "I ain't talking to you, Jew." I heard the heavy feet walk across the floor toward our bedrooms. "Sister, you heard me. What's that you said?" She swelled to fill the doorway. Bailey said, "Mama," his pacifying voice, "Mama, she..." "You shut up, Jew. I'm talking to your sister." I didn't know what scared cow I had bumped, but it was better to find out than to hang like a thread over an open fire. I repeated, "I said, Bailey, by the way, Mrs. Flowers sent you." "That's what I thought you said. Go on and take off your dress. I'm going to get a switch." At first I thought she was playing, maybe some heavy joke that would end with, "You sure she didn't send me something?" But in a minute she was back in the room with a long ropey peach tree switch, the juice smelling bitter at having been torn loose. She said, "Get down on your knees, Bailey Jr. You come on too." The three of us knelt as she began. "Our Father, you know the tribulations of your humble servant. I have with your help raised 2 grown boys. Many's the day I thought I wouldn't be able to go on, but you gave me the strength to see my way clear. Now, Lord, look down on this heavy heart today. I'm trying to raise my son's children in the way they should go, but, oh Lord, the devil try to hinder me on every hand. I never thought I'd live to hear cursing under this roof. What I try to keep dedicated to the glorification of God, and cursing out of the mouths of babes. But you said in the last days brother would turn against brother, and children against their parents, that there would be a gnashing of teeth and a rending of flesh. Father, forgive this child, I beg you, on bended knee. I was crying loudly now. Mama's voice had risen to a shouting pitch, and I knew that whatever wrong I had been committed was extremely serious. She had even left the store untended to take up my case with God. When she finished, we were all crying. She pulled me to her with one hand and hit me only a few times with the switch. The shock of my sin and the emotional release of her prayer had exhausted her. Mama wouldn't talk right then, but later in the evening I found that my violation lay in using the phrase, by the way. Mama explained that Jesus was the way. The truth and the light, and anyone who says, by the way, is really saying, by Jesus, or by God, and the Lord's name would not be taken in vain in her house. When Bailey tried to interrupt the words with, white folks use by the way to mean while we're on the subject, Mama reminded us that white folks' mouths were most in general loose, and their words were an abomination before Christ. That's the end of chapter 15.